The sound of a chalk breaking against a blackboard echoed through the empty hallway. In the soft glow of a single desk lamp, a man's weathered hands traced equations that most of the world's brightest minds couldn't comprehend. But Daniel Carter wasn't supposed to be a mathematician. The world had decided that long ago. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra. Special for you. The fluorescent lights of Prescott Hall flickered as night descended upon Harvard University's mathematics department. Most of the campus had settled into the quiet hush that comes after midnight. But on the third floor, shadows danced against classroom walls as a lone figure moved through the corridor. Daniel Carter, 53 years old with salt and pepper hair and eyes that had seen more life than they let on, pushed his cleaning cart methodically from room to room. Every movement practiced, every gesture efficient from 15 years of the same routine. Daniel wasn't just a janitor. He was the janitor of Prescott Hall, home to some of the world's most renowned mathematicians and their ambitious students. The faculty barely noticed him as he emptied their trash bins or wiped down their whiteboards. To them, he was like the building itself, a constant presence that required no acknowledgement. But Daniel saw everything, the frustration etched on students' faces as they struggled with complex theorems, the quiet triumph when professors made breakthroughs, the subtle hierarchies that existed in this temple of intellect. Tonight was different, though. As Daniel pushed his cart past Lecture Hall B, he noticed that someone had forgotten to erase one of the massive blackboards that covered the far wall. Normally, he would simply wipe it clean without a second thought, but something about these particular equations made him pause. They looked different from the usual calculus problems or algebraic expressions he'd grown accustomed to seeing. These were more elegant somehow, more intricate, like a spider's web glistening with morning dew. Setting his cleaning supplies aside, Daniel approached the board, his fingers hovering just inches from the surface. A problem statement was written at the top. Rousseau conjecture, unsolved. Below, it sprawled a complex series of equations, half-erased attempts, and frustrated question marks. Daniel recognized the name immediately. The Rousseau conjecture had been featured in a documentary he'd watched late one night when sleep evaded him. It was one of mathematics' most notorious unsolved problems, a puzzle that had resisted solution for over 40 years. Daniel's lips curled into a slight smile. Most people didn't know that beneath his janitor's uniform beat the heart of a man who had once dreamed of equations and proofs. In another life, before responsibilities and hardships had redirected his path, Daniel had been a promising young math student, not at an elite institution like Harvard, but at a small community college in rural Ohio, where a kind professor had once told him he had the touch for numbers. That was before his mother's illness, before dropping out to work multiple jobs, before life had calcified around him like sedimentary rock, layer upon unforgiving layer. Yet somehow, against all odds, his love for mathematics had never quite died. It had simply gone dormant, like a seed waiting for the right conditions to sprout again. His small apartment was filled with mathematics textbooks purchased from second-hand, stores, library book sales, and occasionally rescued from department dumpsters when professors purged their collections. Each night after his shift, he would immerse himself in these texts, solving problems that no one would ever see or evaluate. Tonight, standing before the Rousseau conjecture, Daniel felt a familiar stirring, a quickening of his pulse that he hadn't experienced in years. His eyes traced the equations, following the logical pathways that the day's students and professors had attempted. He could see where they'd gone wrong, where their approaches had led them into mathematical dead ends. It was like watching someone lose their way in a forest, where he somehow knew every tree, every path. Without conscious thought, Daniel's hand reached for a piece of chalk. He hesitated for just a moment, his conscience reminding him that he was overstepping his bounds. This was not his classroom, not his problem to solve. He was paid to clean these boards, not to fill them with his own work. But the equations called to him like old friends, and after a brief internal struggle, he surrendered to their pull. The clock on the wall read 1:17 a.m. as Daniel made his first mark on the board. His strokes were tentative at first, uncertain, after so many years of mathematical abstinence, but gradually his confidence grew. The symbols and numbers flowed from him as naturally as breath, as if they had been waiting all these years for this moment of release. He followed pathways that the day's brightest minds had overlooked, made connections that had remained invisible to them. So absorbed was he in the problem that he didn't notice the hours slipping by. The cleaning cart stood forgotten, his duties abandoned in favor of this unexpected communion with his first love. Daniel's fingers were soon white with chalk dust, his uniform smudged where he'd absent-mindedly wiped his hands. None of that mattered. All that existed was the problem before him and the solution that was gradually, miraculously taking shape. Under his guidance, outside, the moon completed its arc across the sky. Inside, Daniel's mind traversed the complex landscape of the Rousseau conjecture, navigating its treacherous terrain with unexpected skill. There were moments of frustration when he hit the same walls that had stymied others, but each time he found a way around, a different approach, a novel perspective that opened new avenues of exploration. At 3:24 a.m., Daniel wrote the final line of his proof. He stepped back, his body suddenly aware of the fatigue that had been held at bay by mathematical fervor. The board before him was a testament to his journey. Equations, diagrams, and annotations covered nearly every inch of the previously half-filled space. He stared at his work, a mixture of pride and disbelief washing over him. Had he actually done it? Had he, Daniel Carter, janitor and high school dropout, solved the infamous Rousseau conjecture? He couldn't be certain. It had been too long since he'd engaged with mathematics at this level. Perhaps there was a fatal flaw in his reasoning, an error that would render the entire proof worthless. Daniel reached for the eraser, suddenly embarrassed by his presumption. Who was he to think he could solve a problem that had confounded the world's greatest mathematical minds for decades? But before he could erase his work, a sound from the doorway made him freeze. Someone was watching. "Don't you dare erase that!" he bawled. The voice belonged to Professor Eleanor Walsh, the recently appointed chair of the mathematics department. At 58, she was a formidable presence, brilliant, demanding, and not known for suffering fools gladly. Her short silver hair framed an angular face that now wore an expression Daniel couldn't quite decipher. How long had she been standing? There? What had she seen? "I'm sorry, Professor Walsh," Daniel stammered, the eraser still clutched in his hand. "I got carried away. I'll clean this up right away and finish my rounds." "Put down the eraser, mister. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." She paused, realizing she didn't know his name despite seeing him nearly every day for the past 2 years. Carter. Daniel Carter. Mr. Carter. Professor Walsh stepped into the room, her eyes never leaving the blackboard. "How long have you been working on this?" Daniel glanced at the clock. "About 2 hours, I think. I should have been cleaning, I know. It won't happen again." Professor Walsh moved closer to the board, her gaze intensely focused on the equations Daniel had written. She traced the lines with her eyes, following the logical progression of his proof. The silence stretched uncomfortably as she absorbed what was before her. "Do you understand what you've done here?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper, Daniel shifted uncomfortably. I was just playing with the problem. I know I shouldn't have. That's not what I asked. She turned to face him directly. Do you understand what you've done? The intensity of her gaze made Daniel straighten his posture instinctively. I think I found an approach to the Rousseau conjecture that works, but I can't be sure. It's been a long time since I've done serious mathematics. Professor Walsh's eyebrows rose slightly. A long time? You've done serious mathematics before? Daniel looked down at his hands, chalk-stained and calloused from years of manual labor. In another life, he said softly. Professor Walsh turned back to the board, her finger now tracing a particular sequence of equations. This transformation here, it's brilliant. I've never seen anyone approach it this way. She shook her head in disbelief. And this connection to topology, how did you see that? Daniel couldn't explain it. It had simply felt right, like finding the correct key for a stubborn lock. It just made sense to me. Professor Walsh continued to examine the proof, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of appreciation. Daniel stood awkwardly to the side, unsure of his place in this surreal situation. The cleaning cart behind him was a stark reminder of the life he actually lived, not the one being momentarily conjured in this classroom at 3 in the morning. Mr. Carter, Professor Walsh finally said, turning to face him fully. I believe you may have just solved one of mathematics' most enduring puzzles. If this proof holds up to scrutiny, and I'll need to examine it more carefully, but if it does, this is extraordinary. Daniel felt a strange lightness in his chest, as if something long compressed was finally being allowed to expand. Thank you, he managed to say, though the words seemed wholly inadequate. I have to ask. Professor Walsh hesitated, clearly struggling with how to phrase her question. How does someone with your obvious mathematical talent end up pushing a broom at Harvard? Daniel finished for her. There was no bitterness in his voice, just a quiet acceptance of life's unpredictable paths. That's a long story, Professor. I'd like to hear it, if you're willing to share. She gestured to the chairs at the front of the classroom. We mathematicians are known for our appreciation of long stories, especially when they contain unexpected variables. Daniel hesitated. His shift wasn't over, and there were still rooms to clean, trash to collect. But the genuine interest in Professor Walsh's eyes was something he hadn't experienced in years, decades even. Slowly, he nodded and moved toward the chair she'd indicated. I grew up in Millfield, Ohio, he began, settling into the seat that would normally be occupied by a student half his age. Small town, limited opportunities, but I had this teacher in high school, Mrs. Levine. She saw something in me that I didn't see in myself. As Daniel spoke, the years seemed to fall away. He told Professor Walsh about winning the state mathematics competition his junior year, about the small scholarship he'd received to attend community college, about the joy he'd felt immersing himself in abstract algebra and analysis for the first time. His voice grew softer as he described his mother's diagnosis, the mounting medical bills, the impossible choice between education and family. I thought it would be temporary, he said, staring down at his hands. Just a semester off to help get things under control. But one semester became 2, then a year, then 5 years. My mother's condition worsened. By the time she passed, I was 32 with no degree and a resume full of service jobs. The door back to mathematics seemed permanently closed. Professor Walsh listened without interruption, her face revealing a deepening empathy with each chapter of his story. When Daniel explained how he'd eventually found his way to Harvard, the janitor position offered stability, health insurance, and access to a world I still loved, even if only from its periphery. She nodded in understanding. And all this time you've continued to study mathematics on your own? She asked. Daniel gave a small, almost embarrassed smile. It's been my companion. Some people have cats or crossword puzzles. I have partial differential equations. Professor Walsh laughed, a warm, genuine sound that softened her academic austerity. Well, Mr. Carter, based on what I'm seeing on that board, you've had quite the productive friendship. She stood up, decision visibly forming behind her eyes. I'd like to photograph your work before you erase it. And then, if you're amenable, I'd like you to come to my office tomorrow. Well, later today, actually, to discuss it further. Daniel felt a flutter of anxiety. I'm not sure that's a good idea, Professor. I'm comfortable with my place here. I don't want to complicate things. Sometimes complications are exactly what we need, Mr. Carter. They're often the precursors to the most elegant solutions. She pulled out her phone and began photographing the blackboard from various angles. Besides, I think you underestimate how hungry the mathematical community is for fresh perspectives, and yours is certainly that. As Professor Walsh documented his work, Daniel felt suspended between two worlds, the one he had accepted and the one he had abandoned. The sensation was both exhilarating and terrifying. What would happen if he allowed himself to step back into a world he'd forced himself to forget? What would it cost him? What would it reveal? When Professor Walsh finished, she turned to him with an expression that had shifted from astonishment to determination. 3 o'clock this afternoon, my office. We have a lot to discuss. It wasn't a request. Daniel nodded, still not fully, convinced this wasn't an elaborate dream brought on by too many late nights and too much solitude. I'll be there. As Professor Walsh departed with one last glance at the blackboard, Daniel was left alone in the classroom. He looked at his leaning cart, then at his proof, and felt the first tremors of a foundation shifting beneath him. For 15 years, he had lived a life of quiet resignation, finding small satisfactions in the familiar routines of his work and his solitary mathematical explorations. Now, in the span of a few hours, that carefully constructed equilibrium had been disrupted. With a deep breath, Daniel picked up the eraser. Whatever happened next, he had responsibilities to fulfill tonight. The floors needed mopping, the trash needed collecting, and the blackboards, even the one bearing what might be his mathematical legacy, needed to be wiped clean for tomorrow's classes. As he erased his work, stroke by careful stroke, he felt not loss, but a strange sense of liberation. The proof now existed beyond this board, captured in Professor Walsh's photographs and, more importantly, validated by her expert eyes. For the remainder of his shift, Daniel moved through the building with renewed awareness. The classrooms and offices he cleaned no longer felt like spaces he merely maintained. They felt like domains he might someday rightfully enter. The theoretical equations on office whiteboards, once distantly admired, now seemed like potential conversations. The journal articles left open on desks, previously glimpsed with respectful curiosity, now beckoned as possible collaborations. By the time the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky, Daniel had completed his duties. He stored his cleaning supplies in the janitor's closet and prepared to head home for a few hours of rest before his meeting with Professor Walsh. As he exited Prescott Hall, the campus was beginning to stir. Early rising students headed to the library, dedicated faculty arriving before the administrative staff, groundskeepers tending to Harvard's immaculate lawns. Daniel's small apartment was just a 15-minute walk from campus, in a neighborhood where academia's edges blurred into the more diverse fabric of Cambridge. It was a modest space, one bedroom, a compact kitchen, and a living area dominated by bookshelves overflowing with mathematical texts. The furniture was functional rather than fashionable, chosen for comfort during long nights of reading. It wasn't much, but it was his, and it had been enough. Until now. As he entered his apartment, Daniel was struck by how clearly it reflected the boundaries he had set for himself, The mathematics books, while numerous, were neatly confined to their shelves, never encroaching on the rest of his life. His notebook of problems and proofs was tucked away in a drawer, taken out only during designated hours of mathematical indulgence. Even the small whiteboard he'd mounted on one wall was partially hidden behind a decorative screen, as if he were embarrassed by this tangible evidence of his intellectual passion. Too wired to sleep despite his physical exhaustion, Daniel made coffee and settled into his worn armchair. The events of the night replayed in his mind, still dreamlike in their improbability. Had he actually solved the Rousseau conjecture? And if he had, what did it mean? For the past 15 years, he had carefully managed his expectations, convincing himself that the life he'd lost was not so valuable, that the life he'd found was sufficient. Now that carefully constructed narrative was threatening to unravel, Daniel's thoughts were interrupted by a text message from a number he didn't recognize. "This is Eleanor Walsh. I've spent the last hour reviewing your work. Preliminary analysis confirms my initial impression. This is significant. My office, 3 p.m. Don't disappoint me." The directness of her message made Daniel smile despite his anxiety. Professor Walsh was clearly not someone who wasted words or emotions. He texted back a simple acknowledgment and then sat staring at his phone, marveling at how quickly the boundaries of his world were shifting. Unable to rest, Daniel pulled out his notebook and began reviewing what he remembered of his proof from the night before. There were sections he wanted to refine, explanations he could make clearer. If he was going to discuss his work with a mathematician of Professor Walsh's caliber, he needed to be prepared to defend his approach. As he worked, the mathematical landscape opened up before him like a familiar hometown after a long absence. The symbols and concepts that had been his private companions for so many years now felt like they might become his public identity once again. It was a disorienting prospect. At noon, exhaustion finally caught up with him. Daniel set an alarm for 2 p.m. and collapsed onto his bed, falling immediately into a deep, dreamless sleep. When the alarm jarred him awake 2 hours later, it took him a moment to remember why he'd set it. Then the reality of his situation came flooding back, bringing with it a fresh wave of nervous anticipation. He showered quickly and stood before his closet, suddenly conscious of his limited wardrobe. Most of his clothes were functional, sturdy pants and shirts suitable for physical work, a few casual pieces for his days off. Nothing appropriate for a professional meeting with the chair of Harvard's mathematics department. In the end, he chose his least worn work pants and a plain blue button-down shirt he usually reserved for holidays and family gatherings. Looking in the mirror, Daniel barely recognized himself. Not because of his clothes, but because of the expression on his face, a mixture of hope and fear he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He ran a hand through his salt and pepper hair, noting the lines that time had etched around his eyes and mouth. At 53, he was far from the young man who had once dreamed of a life in mathematics. But perhaps it wasn't too late for some version of that dream to be realized. The walk back to campus felt different in daylight, charged with a new significance. As he approached Prescott Hall, Daniel experienced a moment of dissonance. For 15 years, he had entered this building through the service entrance at the back, badge in hand, invisible to most of its occupants. Today, he walked through the main doors, his heart beating rapidly as he nodded to students who barely registered his presence. Professor Walsh's office was located on the 4th floor, a corner space with windows overlooking the quad. The door was ajar when Daniel arrived precisely at 3 o'clock. He knocked lightly, peripherally aware that other faculty members in the hallway were glancing at him with mild curiosity. A janitor visiting a professor's office during daylight hours was an unusual sight. "Come in, Mr. Carter." Professor Walsh's voice carried clearly from within. Daniel entered to find not just Professor Walsh, but two other people he didn't recognize. A younger woman with dark-rimmed glasses and an older man whose beard gave him a distinctly professorial appearance. All three were gathered around a conference table covered with printouts, laptops, and notepads. "Mr. Carter, these are my colleagues," Professor Walsh said, gesturing to her companions. "Dr. Abigail Chen, our resident expert in topology, and Professor Martin Geller, whose work on the Rousseau conjecture is widely cited." Daniel shook their hands, acutely aware of the calluses on his palms, physical evidence of the life that separated him from these academics. "Please, sit down." Professor Walsh indicated an empty chair. "We've been reviewing your work from last night. All morning, actually," Dr. Chen added with a smile that held both warmth and professional assessment. "It's quite remarkable." Professor Geller nodded in agreement. "When Eleanor called me at 6 this morning insisting I come in to look at a potential proof of the Rousseau conjecture, I was skeptical, to say the least. Especially when she mentioned it came from," he paused, seemingly searching for a diplomatic term, "from the janitor," Daniel supplied, his tone light despite the implied condescension. "I understand your skepticism, Professor. I'd feel the same way." Professor Geller had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "Yes, well, the mathematics speaks for itself, and yours speaks volumes." Professor Walsh redirected the conversation with practiced ease. "We've spent the last 7 hours examining your approach, Mr. Carter. Your use of topological invariance to bridge the gap in Rousseau's original formulation is ingenious. And your application of non-standard analysis. Where did you encounter that technique?" Daniel thought back to the book he'd found in the department's recycling bin 3 years ago, a dense text on non-standard analysis that had kept him occupied for months. "I've been doing a lot of reading," he said simply. Dr. Chen leaned forward, her expression earnest. "Mr. Carter, we believe your proof is valid. There are some sections that need clarification, some steps that could be more rigorously documented. But the core insight, it's sound. It's revolutionary, actually." Daniel felt a warmth spreading through his chest, a feeling of validation so powerful it momentarily robbed him of speech. He had solved it, actually solved it. "Which brings us to why we asked you here today," Professor Walsh continued. "We'd like to work with you to formalize this proof for publication. A result of this significance needs to be shared with the mathematical community." "Publication," Daniel echoed, the concept feeling foreign in his mouth. "I'm not sure You are more than qualified, Mr. Carter," Professor Geller interjected. "The work speaks for itself." Professor Walsh nodded in agreement. "We would, of course, list you as the primary author. Dr. Chen and Professor Geller have offered to help refine the proof for submission to the Journal of Pure Mathematics. I would serve as the corresponding author to navigate the publication process." Daniel's mind raced with the implications. His name on a mathematical paper, a paper that solved a 40-year-old problem. It was beyond anything he had allowed himself to imagine since abandoning his studies all those years ago. "There's something else we'd like to discuss," Professor Walsh added, exchanging glances with her colleagues. "Harvard's mathematics department has a visiting scholar program. It provides a stipend, office space, and the opportunity to audit courses or engage in research. We think you would be an ideal candidate." Daniel looked at the three mathematicians, searching their faces for any sign that this was an elaborate joke or misunderstanding. He found none, only earnest academic interest and growing respect. "Why?" he asked finally. "Why would you offer this to someone like me?" It was Dr. Chen who answered, her voice gentle but firm. Because mathematics doesn't care about credentials, Mr. Carter. It cares about insight, creativity, and rigorous thinking. You've demonstrated all three. Besides, she added with a small smile, the history of mathematics is full of unlikely. Heroes. Ramanujan was a clerk in India before Hardy recognized his genius. Einstein was working in a patent office when he published his theory of relativity. We're not saying you're Einstein, Professor Geller clarified quickly. Yet, Professor, Walsh added with unexpected humor. She slid a folder across the table. This contains information about the Visiting Scholar Program and our proposal for collaborating on the paper. Take it home, read it, think it over. You don't have to decide immediately. Daniel accepted the folder, his fingers trembling slightly. And my current position, my job, that would be up to you, Professor Walsh replied. The visiting scholar role is part-time. You could potentially continue your current duties if you wished, though on a reduced schedule. Or you could take a leave of absence. Human resources can help navigate those details. As the meeting continued, the three professors took turns discussing specific aspects of Daniel's proof, asking questions and proposing refinements. Daniel found himself engaging with their queries with increasing confidence, his mathematical instincts awakening fully after years of partial dormancy. The language of mathematics flowed more naturally with each exchange, his explanations becoming more articulate, more precise. By the time the meeting concluded, nearly 2 hours had passed. The sky outside had darkened with approaching rain, and the campus was quieting as afternoon classes ended. Daniel stood to leave, the folder clutched in his hand like a talisman. "One last thing, Mr. Carter," Professor Walsh said as she walked him to the door. "Regardless of what you decide about the visiting scholar position, your mathematical contribution deserves recognition. We intend to pursue publication of this proof, with your name prominently featured if you'll allow it." Daniel nodded, overcome by a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "Thank you for everything." As he left Prescott Hall, the first drops of rain began to fall, cool against his skin. Daniel barely noticed. His mind was too full of equations, possibilities, and the sudden, dizzying expansion of his world. For 15 years, he had accepted limitations that perhaps had never truly existed. He had convinced himself that his mathematical abilities were a private pleasure, not a public gift. Now, that careful compartmentalization was crumbling, and in its place was growing something both terrifying and exhilarating: hope. The rain increased as Daniel walked, but he made no effort to hurry or seek shelter. The weather matched his internal state, a cleansing downpour washing away years of quiet resignation. By the time he reached his apartment, he was soaked but oddly refreshed. The folder Professor Walsh had given him was protected inside his jacket, pressed close to his heart. Inside, Daniel changed into dry clothes and made a cup of tea. Then, seated at his small kitchen table, he opened the folder and began to read about a future he had never allowed himself to imagine. The Visiting Scholar Program offered a modest stipend, less than he earned as a janitor, but enough to live on if he were careful. More importantly, it offered legitimate entry into the world he had admired from afar for so long. As night descended, Daniel moved from the kitchen to his living room, surrounded by the mathematical texts that had been his quiet companions for years. He pulled out his notebook and began to work through sections of his proof that the professors had questioned, refining his approach, strengthening his arguments. The hours slipped by unnoticed as he immersed himself fully in the beauty of pure mathematics, without the self-consciousness that had characterized his solitary explorations. At midnight, his phone chimed with a text message. It was from Professor Walsh. "Thought you might want to see this. The word is spreading." Attached was a screenshot of a mathematics forum where someone had posted, "Rumor has it the Rousseau conjecture has been solved at Harvard by a janitor of all people. Anyone have details?" Daniel stared at the message, a complex mixture of emotions washing over him. Fear at the public exposure, at the scrutiny his work would face. Pride that his mathematical ability was being recognized after so many years in the shadows. And underneath it all, a strange sense of vindication for the young man from Millfield, Ohio, who had once believed that numbers could be his life's work. He set the phone down without responding and returned to his notebook. Tomorrow would bring decisions, changes, complications. But tonight, in the quiet of his apartment, Daniel Carter did what he had always done. He lost himself in the elegant, universal language of mathematics, where a janitor could speak with the same fluency as a Harvard professor, where the only authority was logic, and the only credential that mattered was insight. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the city clean, preparing it for whatever might grow in the morning light. The mathematics department buzzed with whispers as Daniel made his way through the hallway. Just 1 week ago, he had walked these same floors invisible, a ghost with a mop and cleaning cart. Now students and faculty alike stole glances as he passed, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. The janitor who solved the Rousseau conjecture, the mathematical prodigy hiding in plain sight. Daniel kept his eyes forward, clutching his worn leather satchel, a gift from Professor Walsh to replace the plastic grocery bag he'd initially used to carry his notebooks. Inside were his refined notes on the proof, meticulously rewritten over the past 7 days during every free moment between his janitorial duties. Today marked his first official day as a visiting scholar, though he had opted to continue his maintenance position on a reduced schedule, working early mornings before devoting his afternoons to mathematics. Professor Walsh's door was open when he arrived, but she wasn't alone. A young man in an expensive suit sat across from her, his posture radiating confidence and privilege. Dean William Harrington, head of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, a man Daniel had only glimpsed at university functions he'd helped set up but never attended. "Ah, Mr. Carter," Professor Walsh said, gesturing for him to enter. "Perfect timing. Dean Harrington was just asking about you." Daniel stepped inside, immediately conscious of the contrast between his simple button-down shirt and the dean's tailored attire. "Good morning, Professor Walsh. Dean Harrington." The dean studied him with undisguised curiosity, as if Daniel were an unusual specimen in the university's collection. "Mr. Carter, your work has caused quite a stir in our academic community." So I've heard," Daniel replied, keeping his tone neutral. The past week had taught him that reactions to his sudden emergence fell into 3 categories: genuine academic interest, patronizing novelty, or outright skepticism. He hadn't yet determined which category the dean occupied. "The Rousseau conjecture is outside my field," the dean continued, "but I understand from Professor Walsh that your solution represents a significant contribution to mathematics." Professor Walsh nodded. "More than significant. Revolutionary in its approach. The topological framework Mr. Carter has developed could potentially unlock several other long-standing problems in the field." The dean smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yes, well, that's precisely why I wanted to meet Mr. Carter. Harvard values intellectual achievement wherever it emerges. We're preparing a press release about this remarkable story. The Janitor mathematician. Human interest pieces like this generate tremendous positive publicity for the university." Daniel felt a familiar tightening in his chest. So that's what this was about, a public relations opportunity. His mathematical insight was secondary to his narrative value. "With all due respect, Dean Harrington," he said carefully, "I'm more concerned with refining the proof for publication than with publicity." Of course, The dean waved a dismissive hand. The academic work is paramount, but surely you understand the broader implications. Your story is inspiring. It demonstrates Harvard's commitment to recognizing merit regardless of background. He leaned forward. We'd like to feature you in alumni communications, possibly arrange some media interviews. The university's development office believes your story could resonate strongly with potential donors. Professor Walsh's eyes narrowed slightly. Dean Harrington, Mr. Carter has only just begun his visiting scholar position. Perhaps we should allow him time to acclimate before thrusting him into the spotlight. Time waits for no man, Eleanor, especially in today's media environment. The dean turned back to Daniel. We're thinking of a feature in the Harvard Gazette, followed by a segment on local news, from cleaning boards to solving them. That sort of angle, human interest with intellectual gravitas. Daniel remained silent, processing this unwelcome development. When he'd solved the Rousseau conjecture, he'd been driven by the pure joy of mathematics, not a desire for attention. The prospect of becoming a human interest story, a curiosity trotted out to impress donors, felt like a violation of something sacred. I appreciate the university's interest, he finally said, choosing his words carefully. But I didn't solve this problem to become a story. I solved it because the mathematics called to me. I'd prefer to focus on my work rather than my biography. Now the dean's expression cooled several degrees. I understand your modesty, Mr. Carter, but this isn't merely about you. The university has invested in your position here. We have certain expectations about how members of our community contribute to institutional priorities. Professor Walsh cleared her throat. I believe what Mr. Carter is saying, Dean Harrington, is that he wishes to be valued for his mathematical contributions rather than as a curiosity, a position I fully support. The tension in the room was palpable. Daniel felt caught between worlds again. The hierarchical structure he'd observed from the outside for 15 years now reaching to enfold him in its complexities. Perhaps a compromise, he suggested. I'm willing to discuss my mathematical approach in appropriate academic contexts, but I'm not comfortable with personal profiles that focus on my background rather than my work. The dean considered this, clearly not entirely satisfied, but recognizing that pushing harder might be counterproductive. We'll revisit this conversation in a few weeks then. Once you've had time to settle in. He rose from his chair. Professor Walsh, Mr. Carter, good day. After the dean departed, Professor Walsh sighed deeply. I apologize for ambushing you with that, Daniel. The dean requested the meeting just this morning. It's all right, Daniel replied, though his discomfort lingered. I should have anticipated this kind of attention. Unfortunately, yes. You're a narrative they want to capitalize on. She smiled wryly. The good news is that academic interest in your work extends far beyond Harvard's PR machine. We've received inquiries from mathematicians at Princeton, MIT, Stanford, all eager to discuss your approach to the Rousseau conjecture. This was the kind of attention Daniel could appreciate, focused on the mathematics, not the man. Have we made progress on the journal submission? Yes, that's actually why I wanted to see you today. Professor Walsh moved to her computer and pulled up a document. Dr. Chen and Professor Geller have reviewed your expanded proof. They have some suggestions for strengthening Section 3, particularly the transition between the topological argument and the algebraic resolution. Daniel set his satchel on the chair and moved to look at the screen. I had concerns about that section myself. It feels less elegant than the rest of the proof. Elegance is a luxury sometimes. Rigor is non-negotiable. Professor Walsh scrolled through the document. They've proposed an alternative formulation here. What do you think? For the next 2 hours, Daniel lost himself in the mathematics, discussing refinements with Professor Walsh, debating approaches, testing alternatives. In this domain, his unusual path to Harvard didn't matter. Only the clarity of his thinking and the soundness of his logic were relevant. It was liberating. As their session concluded, Professor Walsh handed him a key. "Your office is ready. Room 317, just down the hall. It's small, but it has natural light and a decent whiteboard." Daniel took the key. Its weight strangely significant in his palm. An office, a legitimate space within these hallowed walls. "Thank you, Professor." "Eleanor," she corrected with a smile. "If we're going to be collaborating, let's dispense with the formalities, at least when it's just us." Daniel nodded, though the invitation to such familiarity felt foreign. "Thank you, Eleanor." "One more thing before you go," she said, reaching into her desk drawer. "This came for you." She handed him an envelope with the MIT Math Department logo in the corner. Daniel opened it with curiosity. Inside was a formal invitation to present his work at MIT's prestigious mathematics colloquium the following month. His hands trembled slightly as he read it. "They don't invite just anyone," Eleanor noted. "This is significant recognition, Daniel." "I've never presented mathematics before," he admitted. "Not formally, at least. You'll have plenty of time to prepare, and I'll help you." She gave him an appraising look. "This is just the beginning, you know. Once the paper is published, there will be more invitations, conferences, workshops, collaborations. Your life is going to change." Daniel folded the invitation carefully and placed it in his satchel. It already has. Room 317 was indeed small, but to Daniel, it was palatial. The afternoon sunlight streamed through a single window, illuminating a simple desk, 2 chairs, a bookshelf, and a whiteboard that covered the entire back wall. It was located in the older wing of the building, where visiting scholars and graduate students were typically housed, away from the more spacious faculty offices. But to Daniel, it was a kingdom. He set his satchel on the desk and looked around slowly, absorbing every detail. For 15 years, he had only entered offices like this to empty trash bins or replace light bulbs. Now he had his own. The key in his pocket wasn't a master key to access rooms for cleaning. It was his key to his space in this temple of learning. A small placard on the door read, "Daniel Carter, Visiting Scholar." Seeing his name displayed this way sent a curious shiver through him. For so long, he had been invisible in these halls. Now he was named, acknowledged, legitimized. Daniel sat at the desk and pulled out his notebooks. The surface before him was clean, awaiting his imprint. He ran his fingers over the wood, appreciating its smoothness, the way it invited thought and creation rather than merely service. This, he realized, was what he had missed most during his years away from mathematics. Not just the intellectual engagement, but the sense of creating something lasting, something that might outlive him. A knock at the door interrupted his reverie. "Come in," he called, still unused to having the authority to admit someone to a space rather than requesting permission to enter. The door opened to reveal a young woman with curly hair and bright, inquisitive eyes. "Mr. Carter, I'm Sophie Reeves, Professor Walsh's graduate assistant. She asked me to bring you these." She set a stack of books on the desk. "She thought they might be useful references for refining your proof." "Thank you, Sophie." Daniel examined the books, advanced texts on topology and algebraic geometry, several of which he'd glimpsed on faculty shelves, but never had the opportunity to study in depth. Instead of leaving, Sophie lingered, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. "I hope this isn't inappropriate, but I wanted to say that I find your work incredibly inspiring. I'm focusing on topological applications in my dissertation, and your approach to the Rousseau conjecture, it's just brilliant." Daniel felt a rush of unexpected pleasure at this earnest appreciation from a young mathematician. "That's very kind of you. I'd be interested to hear about your dissertation sometime." Sophie's face lit up. "Really? That would be amazing. Most of the faculty are so busy, it's hard to get feedback outside of formal advising sessions." "I'm still getting my bearings here," Daniel said honestly. "But mathematics is mathematics. I'd be happy to discuss ideas." After Sophie left, promising to email him some of her recent work, Daniel turned to the window. Below, students crossed the quad, laughing, arguing, absorbed in their young lives. Professors strode purposefully between buildings, carrying the weight of their knowledge with practiced ease. And somewhere in that tapestry of academic life, the maintenance staff continued their essential work, largely invisible to those they served. Daniel's gaze caught on a familiar figure pushing a garbage bin across the quad. Raymond, one of his co-workers from the facilities department. They had cleaned adjacent buildings for years, occasionally sharing coffee during break periods. Raymond hadn't yet looked up to notice Daniel watching from the window. And for a moment, Daniel felt like a ghost observing his own past life. He should tell Raymond about his new position, explain his reduced cleaning schedule, but the conversation felt daunting. How do you explain to someone still fully embedded in the life you're partially leaving that you've been secretly nurturing? Mathematical abilities all along? Would it seem like a betrayal, as if Daniel had been fraudulently humble, pretending to be just a janitor while harboring grander ambitions? The truth was more complicated, of course, until Professor Walsh had discovered him working on the blackboard that night. Daniel had genuinely accepted his place at Harvard. He had found dignity in his work, taken pride in maintaining spaces where learning happened, even if he wasn't directly participating in that learning. His mathematical pursuits had been private joys, not secret schemes for advancement. Now, straddling two worlds, he felt the weight of transition, the excitement of new possibilities tempered by the awareness that every step forward might be perceived as a step away from his former life and those still living it. Daniel's reflection was interrupted by another knock, more forceful this time. Before he could respond, the door swung open to reveal a middle-aged man with thinning hair and an expression of barely contained irritation. Professor James Simmons, one of the senior faculty members in the department, a man Daniel had observed over the years and privately categorized as brilliant but callous. "So this is where they've installed our maintenance miracle," Simmons said, surveying the small office with undisguised disdain. "Quite a step up from the janitor's closet, I imagine." Daniel rose from his chair, keeping his expression neutral despite the insulting tone. "Professor Simmons, what can I do for you?" Simmons entered uninvited, closing the door behind him. "I'll be direct, Mr. Carter. I've reviewed your supposed solution to the Rousseau conjecture, and I have serious concerns." "What kind of concerns?" Daniel asked, his voice steady despite the sudden acceleration of his heartbeat. "Methodological, primarily. Your approach lacks rigor in several critical areas. The topological framework you've constructed is intriguing but ultimately unsound." Simmons paced the small office like a prosecutor addressing a jury. "I've spent 12 years studying the Rousseau conjecture. I've published 9 papers exploring potential solution pathways. And you expect the mathematical community to believe that a janitor with no formal training beyond community college has succeeded where established mathematicians have failed? The attack was direct, but not entirely unexpected. Daniel had known that skepticism would accompany his sudden emergence. "Mathematics doesn't care about credentials, Professor Simmons," he said, deliberately echoing Dr. Chen's words from their first meeting. "Only the validity of the proof matters. A convenient philosophy for someone lacking those credentials," Simmons retorted. Let me be blunt. I believe you've been coached, that Walsh or Geller or someone else has fed you these ideas and is using you as a front for their work. Perhaps for the novelty, perhaps to bypass peer review through the sheer force of the human interest angle. Either way, it's intellectually dishonest. Daniel felt a flash of anger, quickly suppressed. That's quite an accusation, Professor. One that insults not only me, but also respected colleagues who have vetted my work. Colleagues can be misled or complicit. Simmons leaned forward, his voice dropping. Look, I understand the allure of this opportunity for someone in your position. Suddenly, you're a visiting scholar rather than cleaning up after scholars. But misrepresenting yourself mathematically will ultimately harm everyone involved, including you. Daniel took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. He had anticipated resistance, but not this direct assault on his integrity. Professor Simmons, I understand your skepticism, but I assure you the work is mine. The approach, the insights, the framework, all of it emerged from my own study and thinking. Prove it, Simmons challenged. Not with prepared notes or rehearsed explanations, real-time mathematical reasoning. He moved to the whiteboard and picked up a marker. With quick, aggressive strokes, he wrote out a complex problem, not directly related to the Rousseau conjecture, but adjacent to it, drawing on similar principles. Solve this, he said, stepping back. Now, no references, no consultation, just you and the mathematics. Daniel looked at the board, his initial anger giving way to a strange calm. This was familiar territory, not the confrontation, but the mathematics itself. The problem Simmons had posed was designed to test not just knowledge, but intuition, the kind of mathematical instinct that couldn't be faked or coached. Without a word, Daniel took the marker and began to work. His hand moved steadily across the board, each step flowing naturally from the last. He wasn't showing off or rushing to prove himself. He was simply doing what he had always done in the privacy of his apartment, engaging with the mathematics on its own terms, following where it led. Simmons watched in silence, his expression gradually shifting from skepticism to grudging attention. The problem was substantial, not something that could be solved with simple techniques or memorized approaches. It required creative connections, the ability to see pathways that weren't immediately obvious. After 20 minutes of uninterrupted work, Daniel set down the marker. The board was filled with his neat, precise notation, a complete solution that took an unexpected route, but arrived at the correct conclusion. He turned to face Simmons, not triumphant, but simply present, awaiting judgment. The professor studied the board for a long moment, his eyes moving methodically through each step of Daniel's solution. Finally, he spoke. You took an unusual approach. In the middle section, most mathematicians would have applied Kohler's method there. Kohler's method is elegant, but overdetermined for this particular case, Daniel replied. The modified topological approach I used requires fewer steps and avoids the singularity problem that would arise later. Simmons nodded slowly. Your notation is unconventional. I'm largely self-taught, Daniel acknowledged. I've read widely but haven't had the benefit of standardized training or regular feedback. I'm working to align my notation with current conventions. Another long silence followed as Simmons continued to examine the board. Daniel waited, neither defensive nor eager for approval. In this moment, the only thing that mattered was the mathematics, its truth, its elegance, its undeniable logic. I still have reservations about aspects of your Rousseau proof, Simmons finally said, his tone measurably less hostile. Particularly the transition from the third to fourth sections. But he paused, as if the admission caused him physical discomfort. I no longer question that the work is yours. It wasn't an apology, but Daniel hadn't expected one. In the hierarchical world of academia, this small concession from a senior professor represented a significant shift. I welcome specific feedback on those transitions. He said simply, the proof is still being refined for publication. Simmons gathered his coat, preparing to leave. At the door, he paused. You realize what you're getting into, don't you, Carter? Mathematics at this level isn't just about solving problems. It's political, competitive, often cutthroat. Being right isn't always enough. Sometimes it's about who's right, whose student is right, whose funding is at stake. I'm beginning to understand that, Daniel replied. Walsh is a good ally to have, Simmons continued, but she has her own agenda. Everyone does. With that enigmatic warning, he departed, leaving Daniel alone with the whiteboard full of equations and a growing awareness of the complex human ecosystem he had entered. The sun was setting by the time Daniel left his new office, casting long shadows across the campus. He had spent the remainder of the afternoon refining sections of his proof, incorporating some of the suggestions from Dr. Chen and Professor Geller while maintaining the core integrity of his approach. The work was exhilarating, challenging, in a way that cleaning had never been, though both required attention to detail and systematic thinking. As he walked toward the bus stop, Daniel spotted Raymond again, now loading bags of trash into a maintenance vehicle. This time, their eyes met. Raymond's expression shifted from surprise to confusion to a guarded neutrality. Daniel changed course, heading toward his former colleague. Raymond, he said, extending his hand. Good to see you. Raymond shook his hand briefly. Carter, heard you've moved up in the world. Got yourself an office upstairs now. His tone wasn't hostile exactly, but there was an unmistakable distance that hadn't been there during their coffee breaks. It's been a strange few weeks, Daniel acknowledged. I'm still cleaning, just on a reduced schedule. Early mornings. Now, so we don't overlap much. Raymond nodded, continuing to load bags into the truck. So all this time, you were some kind of math genius, just pretending to be one of us? The question hurt, though Daniel understood its origin. I wasn't pretending, Raymond. I was, a janitor. I've just always loved mathematics, too. The two weren't mutually exclusive until recently. Raymond paused, considering this. Johnson said you solved some famous problem, said they're putting you in journals and shit. That's the plan, yes. It's still being finalized. Huh? Raymond closed the truck's rear door with a definitive thud. Well, good for you, I guess. Not everyone gets a ticket out. He climbed into the driver's seat, effectively ending the conversation. As the maintenance truck pulled away, Daniel stood alone in the gathering dusk, feeling the weight of Raymond's parting words. A ticket out. Was that how his colleagues in facilities saw his new position? Not as an addition to his life, but as an escape from theirs. As if being a janitor was something to be endured until a better opportunity presented itself, rather than work with its own dignity and value. Daniel had never seen it that way. Yes, he had continued his mathematical studies privately, finding joy and intellectual fulfillment in them. But he had also taken pride in maintaining the university's spaces, in doing necessary work with care and attention. He had never looked down on his janitorial role, or seen it merely as a stepping stone. Yet now, straddling these two worlds, he was beginning to understand how others might perceive his transition, not as the natural evolution of a multifaceted person, but as a rejection of one life in favor of another. Better one. The thought troubled him deeply as he boarded the bus home. His apartment felt different when he entered it that evening, smaller somehow, as if his day in the mathematics department had expanded his sense of space. He moved through his familiar rooms with a strange, new awareness, noticing how the mathematical texts that had once been his secret passion were now part of his professional identity. The boundaries between his private intellectual life and his public role were dissolving, with consequences he was only beginning to understand. Daniel prepared a simple dinner and sat at his kitchen table, the day's events replaying in his mind. The dean's transparent attempt to use his story for publicity, Sophie's genuine interest in his mathematical approach, Simmons's initial hostility and reluctant acknowledgment, Raymond's distance. It was more social complexity than he had navigated in years, accustomed as he was to the relative invisibility of his maintenance role. As he ate, his phone chimed with an email notification. It was from Professor Walsh. No, Eleanor, he reminded himself. She had forwarded a message from the Journal of Pure Mathematics. The editorial board had received a draft of his proof and was expediting the review process given the significance of the Rousseau conjecture. The preliminary feedback was positive, though they requested additional clarification in several areas. Before formal acceptance, Daniel set down his fork, a wave of emotion washing over him. This was really happening. His work conceived in solitude, born of a passion that had survived decades of deferral, was being taken seriously by the mathematical establishment. The validation was overwhelming, not because he had craved external recognition, but because it confirmed what he had always known in his heart, that mathematics didn't care where you came from or what title you held. It only cared about truth. After dinner, Daniel cleared the table and spread out his notebooks. The journal's requests for clarification would require careful attention. He worked late into the night, refining his explanations, strengthening his logical foundations, ensuring that every step of his proof was ironclad. This was no longer just a personal exercise. It was his entry into a centuries-old conversation, his contribution to humanity's collective understanding of mathematical truth. As midnight approached, Daniel's phone rang, an unusual occurrence at this hour. The screen displayed a number he didn't recognize. "Hello?" he answered cautiously. "Mr. Carter, this is Dr. Abigail Chen." The topologist's voice was urgent. "I apologize for calling so late, but something's happened that you need to know about." Daniel set down his pen. "What is it?" "Someone has submitted a paper to the International Journal of Mathematics claiming to have solved the Rousseau conjecture. The approach is remarkably similar to yours in its fundamental structure, though the notation and some of the intermediate steps differ." Daniel felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. "Who?" "A former student of James Simmons," Dr. Chen replied. "A young man named Victor Landis, currently at Princeton." The implication was clear, though Dr. Chen was too professional to state it explicitly. Simmons, after seeing Daniel's approach on the whiteboard earlier that day, had potentially shared the core insights with his former student, who was now rushing to publish before Daniel's paper completed the review process. "What does this mean for our submission?" Daniel asked, struggling to keep his voice steady. "It complicates things," Dr. Chen admitted. "We'll need to accelerate our timeline. Eleanor is already reaching out to the editorial board at JPM to explain the situation. We have documentation of your original work, including the photographs from the night Eleanor discovered you working on the classroom blackboard. But priority disputes in mathematics can get messy, especially when established names are involved." Daniel closed his eyes briefly, processing this unwelcome development. Just hours ago, Simmons had warned him about the political nature of high-level mathematics. Now he was experiencing it firsthand. "What should I do?" he asked. "Keep refining the proof as planned," Dr. Chen advised. "Eleanor wants to meet first thing tomorrow morning to discuss strategy. Try not to worry too much, Daniel. The truth of who solved this first will prevail." After they hung up, Daniel sat motionless at his table, surrounded by the papers that represented his life's hidden passion. He had never sought competition or controversy. He had solved the Rousseau conjecture because the mathematics had called to him, because the elegance of the solution had revealed itself in the quiet hours of the night. The idea that this pure intellectual achievement might now be tainted by academic, politics and priority disputes felt like a desecration. Yet as the initial shock faded, a different emotion surfaced. Not anger, but resolve. If someone was attempting to claim his work, it meant the work was valuable, worth stealing, worth fighting for. The Daniel Carter, who had quietly accepted his circumscribed life for 15 years, might have retreated from this conflict, might have decided that the peace of invisibility was preferable to the stress of defending his intellectual territory. But that Daniel was fading, replaced by a man who had remembered what it meant to stand his ground. His solution to the Rousseau conjecture wasn't just a mathematical achievement. It was a testament to his resilience, to the intellectual flame he had kept burning through years of deferred dreams. He would not allow it to be taken from him without a fight. Daniel returned to his notebooks with renewed focus. If a priority dispute was coming, he would be prepared. Every step of his reasoning would be documented, every insight clarified, every connection made explicit. By the time he finally went to bed in the early hours of the morning, his resolve had crystallized into a calm determination. The world of academic mathematics might be more political than he had imagined, but ultimately it was still mathematics. And in mathematics, there was an underlying truth that no politics could permanently obscure. His proof was sound. His approach was original. And whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them with the same quiet persistence that had sustained him through 15 years of invisible intellectual labor. As Daniel drifted toward sleep, the equations from his proof danced behind his eyelids. Their elegant patterns a reminder of why this mattered, not for recognition or status, but for the pure joy of uncovering a truth that had remained hidden for decades, waiting for the right mind to illuminate it. His mind, against all odds, his mind. Morning light filtered through the blinds of Professor Walsh's office as Daniel sat across from her, Dr. Chen and Professor Geller. The atmosphere was tense, the kind of focused energy that precedes important decisions. On the table between them lay printouts of two papers, Daniel's original proof of the Rousseau conjecture and Victor Landis' suspiciously similar submission to the International Journal of Mathematics. The similarities are undeniable, Professor Geller said, tapping the papers with a weathered finger. The core approach, the topological framework, even some of the transitional arguments, they're clearly derived from your work, Daniel. Dr. Chen nodded in agreement. The differences appear deliberately introduced, changes in notation, rearrangement of certain sections, alternative formulations of essentially identical ideas. That's academic theft, Professor Walsh stated flatly, her usual measured tone giving way to undisguised anger. And the timing makes it obvious. Simmons sees Daniel's work on the whiteboard, and less than 12 hours later, his former student submits a paper on the same conjecture using the same approach. The connection isn't subtle. Daniel studied the two papers, feeling a complex mix of emotions. Anger, certainly. The violation was profound, but also a strange sense of validation. His approach was strong enough, innovative enough, that an established mathematician would risk his reputation to claim it. "What options do we have?" he asked, looking up from the papers. Professor Walsh leaned forward. "I've already contacted the editor at the International Journal. They've agreed to put Landis's submission on hold, pending an investigation into priority. I've also reached out to colleagues at Princeton to discreetly inquire about Landis' recent work, whether there's any evidence he was pursuing this approach before your proof emerged. Our immediate priority," Dr. Chen added, "is to accelerate the publication of your proof. The Journal of Pure Mathematics has agreed to expedite their review process. If we can establish your solution in the literature quickly, Landis' claim becomes effectively moot." But the damage to his reputation and Simmons could be significant, Professor Geller pointed out. They won't take that risk lightly. We should be prepared for pushback. Daniel considered this. Until recently, academic disputes had been abstract concepts to him, distant dramas observed from the periphery as he cleaned the spaces where they unfolded. Now he was at the center of one, with his intellectual integrity at stake. "What would you do in my position?" he asked the three mathematicians. They exchanged glances, a silent communication born of shared academic experience that Daniel didn't yet possess. "If it were my work," Professor Walsh said slowly, "I would fight, not just for personal credit, but for the principle. Mathematics has to remain a domain where truth and intellectual honesty are paramount." Dr. Chen nodded. "I agree, but I'd also recognize that how you fight matters. Academic disputes can become bitter, personal. The goal should be to establish priority without descending into the kind of conflict that damages everyone involved. Including yourself," Professor Geller added. "You're just beginning your mathematical career, Daniel. However this resolves, you'll still need to work in this community afterward." Daniel absorbed their counsel, appreciating the blend of principle and pragmatism. "Then we accelerate publication while investigating Lander's claim," he decided. "And in the meantime, I continue refining the proof and preparing for the MIT presentation." Professor Walsh smiled, a hint of pride in her expression. "A measured approach. Now, let's talk specifics about the journal revisions." For the next hour, they worked through the feedback from the Journal of Pure Mathematics, identifying areas that needed strengthening, clarifying complex transitions, and ensuring the proof was as rigorous as possible. It was collaborative, mathematics at its finest, four minds with different strengths working toward a common goal. As the meeting concluded, Professor Walsh held Daniel back while the others departed. "There's something else you should know," she said once they were alone. "The dean called this morning. Apparently, word of Lander's competing claim has reached him, and he's concerned about potential embarrassment for Harvard." Daniel frowned. "What kind of embarrassment?" "The kind that comes from publicly embracing the janitor mathematician, only to face questions about the validity of his work." Her tone made clear her disdain for this perspective. "He's suggested postponing any media involvement until the priority issue is resolved." "I never wanted media involvement in the first place," Daniel reminded her. "True, but his concern reflects something important. People will be watching this dispute closely, and not just for the mathematics. Your unusual background makes this story compelling in ways that affect how the dispute itself will be perceived." Daniel understood. His status as an outsider, a janitor who had crossed the invisible boundary into academic territory, meant this wasn't just about mathematical priority. It was about legitimacy, about who had the right to claim space in elite intellectual domains. "What do you advise?" he asked. "Focus on the mathematics," she replied simply. "That's your strength. Let the work speak for itself. And perhaps," she hesitated, "consider reaching out to Landers directly." To the person trying to steal my work?" Daniel was surprised by the suggestion. "To a young mathematician who may be caught between his own ambition and his mentor's influence," Professor Walsh clarified. "Sometimes direct communication can reveal possibilities that formal disputes obscure." Daniel left her office with much to consider. The campus was alive with mid-morning activity. Students rushing to classes, faculty engaged in animated discussions, staff maintaining the physical and administrative infrastructure that made it all possible. He still belonged to all these worlds, and to none of them completely. His phone buzzed with a text from Sophie Reeves, Professor Walsh's graduate assistant. "Just heard about the land situation." If you need support with research or anything else, I'm here. Your work inspired my latest breakthrough. The message was followed by a link to a preprint paper Sophie had uploaded to the university's repository. The title caught Daniel's eye: Topological Approaches to Persistent Homology, Extensions of the Carter Method. The Carter Method, his approach had already been named, was already influencing others' work. The realization landed with surprising weight. Even if Landers succeeded in claiming the Rousseau conjecture solution, Daniel's mathematical contribution had already begun to spread, to evolve in the hands of others. There was something profoundly satisfying in that, a kind of intellectual legacy he had never imagined having. With renewed determination, Daniel headed to his small office. He had revisions to complete, a presentation to prepare, and perhaps a difficult conversation to initiate with Victor Landers. That conversation came sooner than expected. Later that afternoon, as Daniel worked through the journal revisions, a knock at his door revealed a young man he didn't recognize. Tall, precisely, dressed with the confident posture of someone accustomed to academic success. "Daniel Carter, I'm Victor Landers." The voice was controlled, revealing neither hostility nor warmth. "I believe we should talk." Daniel stood, momentarily speechless at this unexpected development. Then, gathering himself, he gestured to the chair opposite his desk. "Yes, I think we should." Landers entered and sat, his movements deliberate. Up close, Daniel could see the tension in his jaw, the careful neutrality in his expression. "I understand there's some concern about our concurrent work on the Rousseau conjecture." "A concurrent?" Daniel repeated, keeping his tone level. "That's an interesting characterization, given the timing." Landers didn't flinch. "I've been working on topological approaches to the conjecture for 18 months. My submission represents the culmination of that research, which coincidentally evolved into its final form immediately after Professor Simmons observed my proof." Daniel held Landers' gaze steadily. A flicker of discomfort crossed the younger mathematician's face. "Professor Simmons mentioned he'd seen an interesting approach. He didn't provide details. The similarities you're implying are coincidental, a case of parallel discovery, which happens frequently in mathematics." Daniel considered his visitor. There was a rehearsed quality to Landers' explanation, but also a hint of genuine belief. Was it possible that Simmons had influenced his students' work more subtly than direct copying? Had he simply nudged Landers in the direction of Daniel's approach without explicitly sharing the details? "Mathematical truth exists independently of who discovers it," Daniel said finally. "The Rousseau conjecture has a solution, whether you found it or I found it. But the integrity of the process matters." Landers shifted in his chair. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we compare notes directly and honestly. Show me your 18 months of work on this approach. Let me show you my development process. If we truly reach similar conclusions independently, that's remarkable and worth understanding. If not..." Daniel let the implication hang in the air. "You want me to prove my work is original?" Landers' tone sharpened. "I want us both to demonstrate the integrity of our processes," Daniel corrected, "for the benefit of the mathematical community and our own reputations." A long silence followed as Landers appeared to consider this proposal. Finally, he spoke. "Professor Simmons advised against direct engagement. He said it would only legitimize your claim." "And what do you think?" Daniel asked. Landers looked down at his hands, then back up with unexpected candor. "I think I'm in a difficult position. My entire academic future is tied to my relationship with Professor Simmons." The admission revealed more than any technical discussion could have. Daniel felt a surge of empathy for this young mathematician, clearly caught in a web of academic politics and personal loyalty. "Victor," he said, using the first name deliberately, I spent 15 years hiding my mathematical abilities because I believe certain paths were closed to me. Don't let someone else's agenda limit your potential. Something shifted in Lande's expression, a crack in the carefully maintained facade. My notebook contains developmental work that aligns with some of your approaches and predates your proof being discovered, he said slowly. But the final connections, the ones that made everything work, those came after Simmons visited your office. He didn't show me your proof, but he described the conceptual framework, said it gave him an insight he wanted me to explore. It was as close to an admission as Daniel was likely to get. So not direct copying, but not fully independent discovery. Either? Landis nodded reluctantly. The core insight that bridges the topological and algebraic components that appears to be yours, but the surrounding framework represents months of my original work. Daniel considered this complex reality, so different from the simple narrative of theft he had initially imagined. What if we collaborated on a joint paper, he suggested. One that acknowledges both contributions, your extended development of the surrounding framework, my core insight that makes the proof work. We could co-solve the Rousseau conjecture. The proposal clearly surprised Landis. Simmons would never... This isn't about Simmons, Daniel interrupted gently. It's about the mathematics and our integrity as mathematicians. For the first time, Landis smiled, a small, uncertain gesture, but genuine. You're not what I expected, Mr. Carter. Just Daniel, he corrected, and maybe that's part of the problem and the opportunity here. I didn't come up through the traditional channels. I'm not enmeshed in the usual academic politics. That gives me a certain freedom to propose unorthodox solutions. Landis stood, visibly processing this unexpected turn. I need to think about this. Review my notes. Consider the implications. Of course, Daniel replied, standing as well. But don't take too long. The journals are waiting and mathematics deserves our best selves. After Landis departed, Daniel sat quietly, turning over their conversation in his mind. The situation was more nuanced than he had initially believed. The lines between original insight and influence more blurred. Yet somehow, this complexity felt right, more reflective of how knowledge actually evolved than the simplified narratives of lone genius or outright theft. He picked up his phone and called Professor Walsh, who answered immediately. He came to see me, Daniel explained, recounting the conversation. A joint paper? She sounded surprised, but not disapproving. That's an unexpected solution. It feels right, Daniel said simply. His work is genuine, even if the final breakthrough was influenced by mine. Mathematics is collaborative at heart, isn't it? Building on others' insights, extending frameworks, finding connections. Yes, Professor Walsh agreed, though academia doesn't always honor that reality in its reward structures. Are you sure about this, Daniel? You could fight for sole credit and likely win. And then what? He asked. Begin my mathematical career with a victory that leaves scorched earth behind it. I spent too many years watching academic battles, and from the sidelines to want to start that way. Her voice softened. You continue to surprise me, Daniel Carter. Let me know what Landis decides. Either way, we'll adapt our strategy. That evening, as Daniel cleaned the lecture hall where his mathematical journey had begun, he had insisted on maintaining this part of his janitorial duties as a reminder of where he had come from. His phone chimed with an email from Victor Landis. After careful consideration and review of my notes, I believe your proposal has merit. The mathematics should come first. I am prepared to discuss a joint paper that honestly reflects our respective contributions. This may have consequences for my relationship with Professor Simmons, but integrity matters more. When can we meet? Daniel leaned on his mop, a smile spreading across his face. It wasn't a complete resolution, but it was a step toward one that honored the truth while recognizing the human complexities involved. He typed a quick reply, suggesting a meeting the following afternoon. As he finished cleaning the board where his proof had first taken form in the midnight hours, Daniel felt a sense of completion that went beyond the mathematical problem he had solved. The Rousseau conjecture had been a fascinating puzzle, but the real challenge had been finding a way to honor his intellectual gifts without betraying the person he had become during his years of invisible labor. His phone buzzed again. This time, a text from Raymond, his former maintenance colleague. "Heard you might be giving a talk at MIT. That's big, man. Some of us might come watch if that's cool. Proud of you." The simple message brought unexpected tears to Daniel's eyes. Perhaps it was possible to bridge these worlds after all, to be both the janitor who had found dignity in necessary work and the mathematician who had never stopped pursuing truth, even when no one was watching. 4 weeks later, the MIT Mathematics Colloquium was filled beyond capacity. News of the unusual collaboration between a Harvard janitor and a Princeton graduate student to solve one of mathematics' most enduring puzzles had spread through academic circles and beyond. In the front row sat Professor Walsh, Dr. Chen, and Professor Geller. Behind them, a group of Harvard maintenance staff, including Raymond, occupied an entire row, their presence a visible reminder of Daniel's dual identity. Even Professor Simmons was there, his expression inscrutable, but his presence a tacit acknowledgment of the situation's resolution. The joint paper by Carter and Landers had been accepted by the Journal of Pure Mathematics, with publication expedited given the significance of their result. Their solution recognized both Daniel's groundbreaking insight and Victor's substantial development work on the surrounding mathematical framework. As Daniel approached the podium, dressed not in maintenance coveralls or academic regalia, but simply in a clean button-down shirt and slacks, he felt the weight of his journey. From the community college student forced to abandon his studies, to the janitor who had kept his mathematical passion alive in privacy, to the visiting scholar, now preparing to present a major mathematical breakthrough. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice steady despite the fluttering in his stomach. "My name is Daniel Carter. Until recently, I was known primarily as a member of Harvard's maintenance staff. Today, I stand before you as both that person and a mathematician who, with the collaboration of Victor Landers, has found a solution to the Rousseau conjecture." He paused, looking out at the diverse audience. "Our proof demonstrates that mathematics transcends conventional boundaries, between disciplines, between institutions, and between the roles we occupy in society. The solution emerged not from my formal credentials, which are minimal, but from years of patient private engagement with mathematical ideas that called to me regardless of my official capacity." As Daniel moved into the technical portion of his presentation, the equations flowed naturally, his explanation clear and insightful. Questions from the audience, some gently probing, others genuinely curious, revealed not just acceptance of his mathematical authority, but respect for the unconventional path that had led him to this moment. When the formal presentation concluded and the applause faded, Daniel found himself surrounded by colleagues, both mathematicians, eager to discuss extensions of his work, and maintenance staff offering congratulatory handshakes. The boundaries between these worlds, once so impermeable, now seemed more permeable, more flexible than he had imagined possible. As the crowd thinned, Professor Walsh approached, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Well done, Daniel. Not just the mathematics, though, that was excellent. The way you've navigated this entire situation, it's been remarkable. I had good guidance," he acknowledged. "Perhaps. But the core insight was yours, in more ways than one. She handed him an envelope. The department has approved an extension of your visiting scholar position for 2 years, with the possibility of conversion to a more permanent role after that. Daniel accepted the envelope, feeling once again the strange vertigo that came with crossing boundaries he had long accepted as fixed. Thank you, but I'd like to maintain some of my maintenance duties, at least for now. Professor Walsh raised an eyebrow. May I ask why? Daniel considered how to express something he was still coming to understand himself. Because both roles are part of who I am, he said finally. The janitor who notices details others miss, who maintains spaces so learning can happen. That person solved the Rousseau conjecture just as much as the mathematician did. I don't want to lose him in becoming someone new. She nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes. You know, Daniel, mathematics needs more of that perspective. The recognition that intellectual work doesn't happen in isolation from the physical world or the diverse experiences that shape our thinking. As they walked together toward the reception that followed, Daniel reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He had not escaped his life as a janitor for something better. Rather, he had expanded the definition of what that life could include, had refused to accept that intellectual passion and manual labor existed in separate hierarchical realms. The Rousseau conjecture had been solved, not despite his years of invisible work, but partly because of them, because of the patience they had taught him, the attention to detail they had honed, the humility they had instilled. His mathematical breakthrough was not a rejection of that history, but its unexpected fruition. In the warm light of the reception hall, as mathematicians and maintenance workers mingled in a scene that would have seemed impossible just months before, Daniel Carter stood at the intersection of worlds, no longer divided, but wonderfully, improbably whole. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.